This Investigate Woodlands webinar and the programme itself is being very kindly funded by the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. And we in Leaf have teamed up with Green Schools to offer these Investigate Woodlands workshops to schools around the country. And then today is basically a snapshot of what those workshops would be, and we're offering it to all Green Schools. So you may be working on the Investigate Woodlands project, or you may not, just in case you're confused about where it's all come from. So this week is also Tree Week, which is why we're running our webinar. Now, hang on one second, because my screen, oh, here we go. So we're running this webinar because it's Tree Week. It's National Tree Week. So there's schools and communities all around the country that are either planting trees or maybe holding educational walks and talks, celebrating trees and everything related to them, forests and woodlands, hedgerows, all of it. And actually on Monday just gone, it was International Day of the Forests. So worldwide celebrations for our trees. So this is why we're having our webinar this week. As I say, I'm working on the LEAF program, which is an international program. It's like the Green School, so it's based on different themes, and you can see them there up on the screen. There's biodiversity, climate, water, products, and community. And if you've signed up for our Investigate Woodlands workshop, one of us will be coming out to visit your school, and we'll be doing different activities based on these different themes. So today's webinar is a quick whistle-stop tour through those themes. So we're not going to go into any great detail on them, but what I would say to your teachers today is that we've got loads and loads of resources and activities available on our website. Claire might pop the link into the chat for you. So anything that we're doing today or talking about today is also all available on our website, okay? Before we get into the current situation, I'm just going to give you a quick history of Ireland's forests since the last ice age, okay? So about 10,000 years ago, after the last ice age, the first trees started to grow across the country, and these would have been kind of pioneer species such as birch, willow and juniper. And then about 8,000 years ago, Ireland was really dominated by forests. So we had our giant oak, elm and Scots pine. So if you can imagine, if you were a squirrel back then, you would have been pretty much able to hop from one end of the country to the next through the treetops. So it was very, very different to what we have today. So anybody like to give a guess of the different type of species you might have found in the woodlands back then? So all those years ago, if you want to pop them in your chat there and we can have a look. Whoops. I don't know why my screen is jumping ahead. So bears, very good, yeah. Wolves, wolf, elk, fantastic. Yeah. Fox, yeah. Elk again, very good. So you've got it right there. Let's see. Sorry guys, I don't know why my screen is. There we go. So you answered very accurately there, guys. We had wild boar, which left maybe only about 6,000 years ago. Bear as well, which we often are surprised to hear. Giant elk, you can see there, they're huge antlers, and there's actually the skeleton of one of these in the National History Museum in Dublin, if you ever get a chance to get to go there. And wolves roamed the countryside as well. So they were here up until about 250 years ago. And a lot of these would have been hunted to extinction for their meat and their fur. But yeah, so our landscape would have looked very, very different back then, okay? And then something big happened, humans arrived. And in the early days, because I suppose we didn't have the tools and the big machinery that we have now, our impact on our forest was very small to begin. So it was, and even up until the medieval times, there was huge tracts of forest that still remained throughout the countryside. But then about 1,000 years ago, there was huge changes started to happen across the countryside. So there was more people to begin with. And with more people, of course, there's more demand for space and more demand for food. So we started growing more crops. We started keeping husbandry like cattle and sheep and that. So our landscape started changing quite dramatically. We were clearing a lot of our forest areas for the production of crops and for the keeping of our farm animals, let's say. And of course, then there was the industrialization time where factories started being built, and there was huge requirement for fuel to manage these big factories and ironworks. The charcoal was used in these industries. And then of course the trains, these were able to move the timber from big areas, from one area to the next. So it just meant there was huge demand for our wood. We were also exporting it to England for barrel making and for shipbuilding. So huge vast areas of our forests were then destroyed over more recent years. And today, what we are left with is just 11% of our land in Ireland is forested. Now, most of this land is actually non-native species, and we'll come back to this in a moment. And just around 2% of our land is actually our native Irish species. And again, we'll talk about native and non-native in a few moments. So a huge change in our countryside over the last few years. So, time to get to your chat box again, guys. I'm going to ask you a few questions here. We're talking about our woodlands nowadays. And I suppose our most important question is, can anyone tell me what trees do for us and how we benefit from them? Oxygen, yeah. They help to clean the air, very good. Produce oxygen, paper, give us oxygen, absolutely. So lots of you getting that right. Pencils, Hurleys, housebirds, fantastic, guys, okay. Yeah, take in carbon dioxide, wood for furniture, beauty, excellent, well done. I wasn't expecting to see that response, so very good, guys. So, what is this? So, in our opinion, trees are absolutely amazing. They do so much for us, and a lot of you answered correctly. They help to clean the air. They provide us with oxygen, and not only do they just give out oxygen, but they actually take in carbon from the atmosphere. And as we know, we've got far too much carbon in our atmosphere nowadays because of all the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation. So the fact that trees actually take in this carbon, and even better still, give us oxygen to keep us alive, they are doing a really important job. They also help to cool the planet down. They're part of our water and air cycles. They help to store and recycle our nutrients. They defend us from flooding. So in this picture here, you can see the root system, and they obviously suck up huge amounts of water. And they also provide, or they create, let's say, little air pockets throughout the soil. So if there is a heavy rainfall, the rain comes down and it drains into these pockets around the roots, and that stops this kind of flash flooding that we see in some parts of the country, some parts of Ireland and other parts of the world as well. So really important in defense from flooding. They provide shelter from wind and rain. So if you ever are going through the countryside, you often see on a maybe windy or wet day, animals even taking shelter along the hedgerows. Or if you get caught out in a shower, one of the first things you might look for is a tree and stand under the canopy of it. We all know as well that they provide home and refuge for a huge amount of our wildlife communities, both animal and plants, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And what we have a lot of in Ireland is hedgerows. So all the hedgerows that line our fields around the countryside, they provide really important corridors for our wildlife to move from one area of forest to another. and they connect up our habitat. So our hedgerows in Ireland are huge importance because we have so little forested areas. The hedgerows play a really important part. They also, and some of you got the right answer here as well, they provide wood to make boats and houses. They provide fuel and charcoal. They provide fibre as well. And some of you even mentioned this as well. They also simply give us beautiful places to visit. So I'm sure many of you love to visit your local woodland or forest, or maybe even you've got some trees planted in your back garden and you like to sit out under there during fine weather. Places to go for well-being. You can see in the picture here, one of our classes of students, we went to the Currachase Forest and they were just chilling out, enjoying the sounds of nature around them. Our forests provide us with medicine and food. I'm sure any of you, if you opened up your lunchbox, you've got apples in there, oranges maybe. So they provide us with lots of food. They're also a source of names for people and places. The road that I live on myself is called Alderwood Road. Alder likes to grow in wet ground, and where we live is very wet. So it's the name of the street that I live on. In times gone by as well, it was connected to our history if we think of the Brehon laws. So forests and products, guys, and some of you mentioned this as well, that our trees give us wood for products. Can any of you guess, again in your chat box, maybe put in some things, have a look around your classroom and pop in the chat box there the things that you can see around you that are made from wood. Oh gosh, the answers are flying in again. Great, guys. Wooden gates, shelves, desks, pencils, jigsaws, hurleys, furniture, bookshelves, paper, pencils. Brilliant, guys. Yeah. Cupboards, tables and chairs. Pegs, very good. I hadn't thought of that one myself. Excellent, guys. Fences, brilliant. I think you've actually hit everything there. So the hurley stick, we all are familiar with this one. And before we go back to the products again, can anyone tell me which tree we get the wood from for our hurley stick? Ash, very good. Okay. So we get the wood from our ash tree. And actually, you may not know this, but if you see in the top picture there, the base of the tree. So if you imagine your trees growing in your garden or your school, the part that kind of is close to the ground, the tree kind of kinks out towards the bottom. And that's the part of the tree that they use for the hurley stick, because if you imagine the shape of the hurley and the shape of the bottom of the tree, that's the part that they use for the hurley stick, okay? Now, unfortunately, our ash in Ireland is suffering from a disease at the moment, so we're not able to plant any new ash. And unfortunately, a lot of the ash that is growing is having to be cut out. So we're importing our ash to make our hurley sticks from countries like Poland and that. So we're hoping that the situation improves. So back to our products again, lots of you answered the question and you put in paper, tables and chairs. Some of you mentioned fence posts. So all of these things are made from wood, and it might be another exercise that you can do. Go home this evening and have a look around your house and maybe think of all the things that are made from wood. You can even, your picture frames on the walls, lots and lots of different things that maybe we're not mentioning here in our list, okay? So walking sticks, boats, chopping boards, fence posts, tables and chairs. And the list goes on. And another little exercise that you might like to do is maybe invent your own wooden product. So think of maybe what tree you might select. Is it a hardwood or a softwood? And maybe invent a new product and maybe price it up and things like that. So that might be a nice little activity for you to do. So this is something that we do in schools. We bring these two, if you're looking at the screen there, you'll see two big blocks of wood. And one of them, the darker one, is oak wood, and the lighter coloured block of wood is from Sitka spruce. So this is considered a soft wood. It grows much quicker, and this type of wood would be used for something like the rafters in your attic. because it wouldn't make sense to use a big heavy piece of wood up in your attic. So instead you might look at using hardwood like oak for flooring, where people are trampling across with their big mucky boots or high heels maybe, and it would be a really good idea to use something like a hardwood for flooring in your kitchen or your living room, and then using something like a softwood for the attic space, for, you know, the woods that we make our attic with. So something again to think about, hardwoods and softwoods, and why we grow the different types of trees and what we use them for. And again, just for the teachers that are listening, we have lots of resources available on our website, and we have lots of prompt questions in relation to this kind of idea of the products and forests, okay? So just a little video to show you the difference in the weight of the two of them. So you could see there that they were throwing the lighter coloured one up really easily, much lighter than the heavy oak wood. So forest and biodiversity, guys, we are surrounded by lots and lots of different trees. You might think about your trees in your schoolyard or maybe at home. And we have native trees and non-native trees. So native trees are trees that have been in Ireland for many years. And in non-native trees are trees that we've brought to Ireland generally for wood production, like what we were just talking about there, for things like building, for pulp, for paper, cardboard, and things like that. So back into your chat box again, guys, can any of you think of any native trees that we have growing in Ireland? Hazel, very good, yeah. Cherry, birch, oak, sycamore in there, oak again. Oak, very good. Willow, horse chestnut. Okay, so I'll come back to some of these in a moment. Ash, very good. Fantastic, loads of answers coming in there. Some conifers, good, very good. We'll come back to that. Yew, excellent, and holly. Okay, fantastic, guys. So let's see what we got. So the native trees of Ireland, alder. Alder loves to grow in wet ground. As I mentioned already, the road that I live on is called Alder Road. Ash from our hurley stick. Aspen, we've got two types of birch, downy and silver. Cherry, some of you mentioned that in your responses. We've wild and bird cherry. Blackthorn, crabapple, hazel. Some of you answered hazel. Hawthorn, holly, juniper. We actually have two different types of oak, pedunculate and sessile. So both of those are native, and we actually have other oaks that are growing here as well that have been introduced, red oak and things like that. The rowan or the mountain ash, Scots pine. So some of you did say some of our pine trees are native, and you were right there, because Scots pine is one of our native ones. Strawberry tree, which tends to, you only find that really down the southwest here, I think, in little parts of Kerry. So it's not a very common tree. White beam, willow, loads and loads of willow growing, wych elm and yew. So you got loads of those correct, guys. So well done there. Can any of you then tell me some of our non-native trees? So back into your chat again. So chestnut. I think some of you mentioned sycamore a moment ago. Beech, very good, yeah. Horse chestnut, excellent. Spruce. Palm tree, very good, yeah. Pine again. Cherry blossom. Maple, excellent, guys, well done. Okay, so a lot of you got the horse chestnut, sweet chestnut. Somebody mentioned beech, so that's one of our non-native trees, even though we see quite a lot of beech and sycamore growing around our countryside, and a lot of people plant beech for hedging because it tends to keep their leaves. Sitka spruce, so this is the one that we see most often as a plantation tree. This is the one that they grow for things like the wood for bark, sorry, not bark mulch, but chipboard, things like this, paper, and for our buildings as well. Norway spruce, Douglas fir, larch, western red cedar, and lodgepole pine. So all of these have been introduced, and very often they've been introduced for the production purposes, okay? So looking at the biodiversity that we have in our woodlands, in our hedgerows, again, not forgetting the hedgerows, guys, because we have so many hedgerows and so few of our woodlands. Our hedgerows, again, are really, really important for our biodiversity. And biodiversity is basically another word for nature, or plants and animals that we find living in our countryside. So we also, when we talk about biodiversity, we're talking about the mosses, the lichens, liverworts, fungi, insects, birds, and mammals. And we're going to just give some examples of some of these. But can you think of any of these species that might like to live in our woodland? So we know the boar are gone, we know the wolf is gone. And can you think of any species that might be living here nowadays? Birds, fox, absolutely. Owl, squirrel, very good. Deer, pine marten, excellent. Frogs, rats, absolutely. Badgers, loads of different types of birds. Hedgerow, or hedgehog, sorry. I've hedgerow in the mind. Brilliant, guys. Okay, so you've got loads of correct answers there. Mink, yeah. So let's see. Let's look at our birds first, guys. Now, lots of different birds living in our woodlands, but in particular, we have the hawfinch. So these are great for cracking open they've got very strong jaws for cracking open the seeds, which help with the dispersal then of the seeds of the trees, and hopefully new trees will grow in other areas where the seeds are dropped by these birds, okay? We have the iconic woodpecker, which has more recently returned to our woodlands, which is fantastic. The jay, so we have him, he's our secret weapon for acorn dispersal. So again, just like the hawfinch, a lot of our birds will eat seeds from the trees, and then they'll fly off and they'll disperse them, and hopefully new trees will grow in new areas. We have the owl, we have the barn owl, which we're probably most familiar with, and we have the long-eared owl as well, which lives in our woodlands. And another bird that's returned, again, with some success, is the white-tailed eagle, and they can be found nesting high up in the canopy. So they're just some of our birds that live in our woodlands. And the mammals, many of you mentioned the squirrel. So we do have actually the red squirrel, which is our native, and we have our non-native grey squirrel, which was introduced. And in the earlier years, it was actually competing with the red squirrel. It was eating a lot of the acorns before the red squirrel would get to them. And the grey squirrel also carries a virus or disease that the grey squirrel isn't killed by it, but unfortunately our red squirrel is. However, the story goes that the pine marten, which once was in our forest, was hunted and then was protected by Irish law. So the pine marten numbers started to increase. And pine marten, what do they like to eat? They like to eat squirrels. But the grey squirrel is a little bit slower and tends to eat more down on the ground. So the pine marten is actually catching the grey squirrel and reducing its numbers. And in areas where the pine marten is doing well, the red squirrel is also starting to do much better. So this has been one of our nice success stories, I guess. The lesser horseshoe bat, we've got lots of different bats in Ireland. The lesser horseshoe bat can be found in areas like the Curragh Chase in Limerick, in that forest there. The big old house that's within that wood is protected because the lesser horseshoe bat roosts there. And then, of course, we've got the majestic red deer as well in our woods. So if you ever get a chance to visit Killarney National Park, you might be lucky enough to see the red deer roaming there. We've our amphibians, we've our newts and frogs, and they can often be found nesting under the leaf litter, which falls in the autumn time, and they might be found nesting under this leaf litter. And then after the winter, they'll move back towards the water bodies to spawn. So definitely keep an eye out for the frogs. Now remember that they're often very well camouflaged. So camouflage means that they blend in with their surroundings. So they might be hard to spot. But if you do find an area near water and in the woodlands, you might be lucky enough to find the frogs jumping about. We also have a huge array of bugs or insects. So some species like willow and oak, they can host over 280 different species, okay? So that might be actually thousands or even millions of individual species resting on willow and oak trees. So really important for our wildlife. The oak tree, if you ever see a mature oak tree, the bark is really rough and gnarly. So lots of little cracks for places for bugs to hide in. So get your magnifying glass or your hand lens and have a little close investigation of these trees. You'll be sure to find lots of different species. So very quickly, guys, just before we go on to some questions and answers, I'm just going to touch briefly on forests and water and forests and climate. But again, just for the teachers, we've got lots of resources, we've got information sheets, and these are teamed up then with activity sheets, and we've got videos as well on our YouTube channel of different activities that you can do to show the benefits of trees for the water, for example, retaining the water in the soil and things like that. So definitely have a look on our website, guys, for more activities and resources. So we mentioned this already in the benefits of trees. Trees have a cooling effect on our environment. You simply have to go and sit under a tree and you can feel the effect of how it cools the air around you. They also help to make clouds. So above the forests or our woodlands, tiny little particles might rise up from the forest, and these are swept into the atmosphere. And they make the process easier because they provide surface for the water to condense on. So they actually help to make clouds and therefore help for more water in rain or wet in areas where there's deserts. If you can get trees established again, growing in these areas, they can really help to create clouds and rain in these areas. Forests also play a part in the water cycle. We mentioned this earlier. And again, coming back to the flooding and the impacts of trees. So their root system, not only do they suck up lots of water, but they create holes and spaces for water to flow into. So it stops this flash flooding that we get in certain parts of the country or around the world. In relation to forests and climate then, we talked about this and some of you answered correctly in relation to trees using up carbon and giving us oxygen. So they play a very important role in the carbon cycle. They also store carbon. So as a tree is growing, it stores carbon. Once a tree gets very old, it actually starts releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. And if we cut a tree and burn it, that also releases the carbon back into the atmosphere as fossil fuels, okay? The greenhouse effect, so deforestation, we all hear about this, especially in areas of South America or Africa, where deforestation is happening on a large scale, and of course the burning of fossil fuels. So trees, again, they can take in this carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so planting trees can really have a huge impact on our climate change and the greenhouse effect. So if you do nothing else this week, to celebrate Tree Week, I would highly recommend getting out there and planting a tree or two, either on your school grounds or in your garden at home, or maybe even in your community if there's a little community woodland. So finally, guys, forests and community, communities around the world are linked to forests through products and livelihoods. So can any of you think, last question before you start asking us questions, can any of you think of any jobs that might be related or connected to the forest? Leisure, absolutely. Yeah. Archaeologists, yeah. Woodwork, fantastic. Carpenter, brilliant. Maybe even my own job, education, lecturing, teaching students about the woodlands. Lumberjack, tree surgeon, fantastic, guys. Yeah. Park ranger, well done. Okay, so yeah, carpenter again, hedge cutters, fantastic. So loads of different jobs are connected to the forests. You might even start considering careers in jobs or in the forest yourselves. I know we have a couple of secondary schools sitting in on the webinar today. So, and the different countries will vary in relation to their connection to the forest. A lot of our European countries, like the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, they have huge areas forested. So above 30% of their land is forested. And you might remember I mentioned that just 11% of Ireland is forested. So huge employment and jobs in countries like the Nordic countries where they have vast areas forested. And of course, you've got all the machinery connected to the forestries. All these people need, all these machines need drivers and workers and laborers. So lots of connections there. So that is pretty much it, guys. The last thing I'm just going to mention is if you are going out to the forest, or even just your green area in your school grounds, plan ahead, make sure you wear appropriate clothing. There's nothing worse than being outdoors and being cold and wet. So make sure you've got the right gear on. Make sure you bring your clipboard, your magnifying glass, so that you can get a real close look at the trees and maybe their leaves now as we come into the spring and summer. The trees are starting to bud, so taking a closer look at the different leaves and the different bugs that you might find. And we would always encourage schools to record and report anything that they see in their woodlands or their school grounds. And we would always suggest as well keeping a nature notebook, or maybe even having a nature table in your classroom where you bring in different leaves or parts of the tree and do a little bit of project work or research on them. Okay, so that's it, guys. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Claire is going to put us on the spotlight. And myself, Claire, Rob and Niamh are going to unmute ourselves and answer any questions. Now it's your turn to ask us some questions. So if you've got anything for us, and I know, Claire, actually we had some questions sent in to us. So if you want to start off with maybe one or two of those questions.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. That was brilliant. So yeah, we got a lot of great questions sent in advance. So these ones are from the 3rd and 4th class students in Mellick National School in Clare. So they asked a lot of questions. So one interesting one was, how long does it take a dead oak tree to start to rot? Maybe Niamh, I know Niamh had some thoughts about this.
I have some thoughts too, but let's go, Niamh.
Thanks, Rob. I suppose when we were thinking about this earlier, Rachel had mentioned there's softwoods and hardwoods. And so softwoods would tend to rot quicker, and oak would be a hardwood. And oak has a lot of what's called tannins in it. That's why people have used them to tan leather, and they use them for caskets because the wood lasts such a long time. So the way we were thinking is oak wood would take a long while to rot, but the more, it depends on where it is. If an oak tree falls in the woodland where it's damp and where there's lots of mushrooms, you know, fungi, and also loads of creatures like woodlice and caterpillars and slugs and snails and all those creatures, the more of that web of life that's in the area, the quicker the wood would break down. But if the wood was up on a hill, like, you know, kind of where there isn't much going on, it might sit there for longer. The other thing to remember is that dead wood can often host more life than living wood in a way, because all the creatures in the woodland are like little recyclers. So when you move a log and you see all these little springtails and all the creatures, when you go investigating, they're actually all helping to decompose the wood, but they're not doing it by themselves. One creature helps another creature who helps another creature, and then the blackbirds, and they come in and they start making holes in them, looking for slugs and snails. So it's back to the web of life, really. So maybe it could be for your investigations, you might put a log in under a hedgerow, and then you might put a log somewhere else, maybe near some concrete, and just see the difference and see how quickly one breaks down compared to the other. So Rob, I don't know if you want to add to that.
I was going to say something similar. It depends on where it falls, and there's a lot of factors, but I mean, you can take an average of what they would say is about 15 to 20 years for an oak tree to decompose. And then there's parts of the tree that will decompose more fast than the rest. So the trunk itself will take the longest, but some of the branch and bark might go well before that.
Great. Okay, there's loads of great questions coming in here, guys. So
Some
I'm just
tough
going to go.
questions too.
Yeah, and some tough questions. So one of the ones here that's popped up, which trees are used the most for building houses and furniture? So that depends on what you're building, I guess. So with furniture, people tend to use maybe the harder wood, I would say. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. And for the actual structure of the houses, you'd be looking at maybe the softer wood. So there's lots of different soft woods and hard woods within that group. So the other question that's popping up here is, what's the oldest tree in Ireland? So there's a yew tree growing in the Muckross Friary, and it's about 670 years old. There's another one in Maynooth College, and that's about 700 to 800 years, okay? So I don't know, guys, that if you want to come in there with any of the other questions, there's one here. Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
One sent in about which is the biggest tree, and we have that would be a Douglas fir in Powerscourt, which interestingly is an introduced species. So it's interesting that that's the biggest tree in Ireland.
And it's taller than, if anyone's been into Dublin, it's taller than Liberty Hall. Taller, more than 60 meters, taller than Croke Park. So it's tall, really tall.
That's tall.
Yeah.
And there's one here as well. What's the best tree for biodiversity? I guess we would say oak, but then all our native trees are good for biodiversity. But I suppose in terms of the diversity of species, we would say oak, unless anybody else wants to add to that there.
Well, I suppose I might just mention oak. The holly tree loves to grow next to oak. So again, trees love to grow in communities. So often you'll find, and the little holly blue butterfly needs the holly and the oak as part of their life cycle. So again, it's really hard to always look at them in isolation, but it's true. And I suppose because oak is one of the longest and oldest living and most stable in the ecosystem, but you always need the understory of the little hawthorns and elders as well. So it's kind of about having a mixture. That's the diversity, back to that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's an interesting one there. The last one, sorry, question that came in is, which tree grows most commonly in Ireland? And I don't know if the answer to this is right. You could say ash, but that would be my guess, right? But then is it actually one of the trees that we introduced for forestry that, like our spruce, that grow most commonly? I don't know what the answer is, so maybe someone else does.
I think it's Sitka spruce, which is the one that you kind of see planted for forestry, all growing together. I'm pretty sure is more common, which is a bit of a shame.
Yeah, so I mean, if we were to leave it alone, it would be ash.
Yeah,
and if it's because we've introduced trees to grow as forestry, it's not. But I thought that was a really interesting question. And on that as well, there was another interesting question sent in before about why trees need CO2 and not O2. But of course, they need both. So they take in the CO2, keep the carbon, that's their building blocks, and they breathe out O2. And that's what we always say. But they also breathe in O2 mostly at nighttime, if I'm not wrong, through a process called cellular respiration. So they need both. Just like we breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide, they do the same, and they reverse it as well. So it's not that they don't need O2, they do need it as well.
And guys, I just see that it's come up once or twice there. So the question is, we know that it's 11% of Ireland that's forested, but where is the most populated area? And then there's another kind of related question down below. But I suppose in my head, I would have said Killarney National Park in relation to our, let's leave the plantation forests aside, the Sitka forests. But if we're looking at our native forests, would Killarney National Park be the most forested area part of the country? Or would
imagine it's between them and Glenveigh, is it?
And Glenveigh, yeah, I wasn't sure.
And it might actually be Glenveigh now with the damage that was done with the forest burning in
oh yeah,
Yeah.
So I'm not sure. I
So either
would say it's
Glen Bay
between
or-
the two,
Yeah.
but overall, let's say Kerry probably is the area that has most.
Yeah. There were two questions I was going to look at, Rachel. One was, do native trees have bigger root systems than non-native trees? And that's an interesting question. I suppose some trees have shallow roots, like a birch tree, and then a lot of the pines would have shallow roots. And then oak trees and ash tend to have deeper tap roots. But the way we see it is, if you're out under a tree, what they say is what's above is below. So the canopy of the tree that's around, when you look up, that's probably mirrored underneath the ground. And then just some trees have a taproot that goes deep down, and then others are more shallow. And they might be the ones that come over in a storm. Often, if you'll see now, when the ground has been very wet and there's a lot of wind, you'll often see very shallow roots. They're the trees that often have come down. So it's not that non-native or natives have bigger roots than the other. It's just, it depends on the canopy of the tree. And then some roots, like willow, like to follow water. So they'll often head off towards water as well. So whereas if you keep a hedgerow clipped, that's how wide the roots will be, if that makes sense. And I was just going to come in on one other really important tree, is the hazel tree. Someone asked about the use of fence posts. And hazel, if you're living in a place like in Cork called Ballincollig, and that's Baile an Coilg, which is the woodland of it's the hazel, it's generally a hazel wood when it's called a quill. And hazel was so useful. We used hazel obviously for the nuts for protein. So they found like loads of evidence of the nut collections that people would have done for the winter time for food. And also they would have traditionally cut the hazel tree kind of every 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, or 7 years, depending on how thick you wanted the wood to be. Like, did you want it for a bean pole to grow up vegetables up it, or did you want to grow a fence post? Or if you're watching show jumping, you'll see the hurdles that they've made. They're often made out of hazel as well, and sometimes willow. So I suppose, again, hazel is one of those really useful trees, and you can coppice them where you cut them to the ground every few years and use the wood, and they grow back again every year as well.
Fantastic. We're happy to stay on for another few minutes because there's loads of questions still coming in, but I just see 1 or 2 schools logging off. And to those schools that do have to go, do get in touch with us. We're more than happy to take out any questions that you haven't had time to ask us here. Definitely go to our website and have a look. There's loads of information and lots of great resources. And within the resources, then there's links to other sites and other useful resources. As I say, we've got our YouTube channel as well with lots of helpful videos there as well, demo videos and things like that. If you are doing the Investigate Woodlands workshop with us, we will be in touch, hopefully, to set a date with you soon. If you are doing any planting to celebrate Tree Week this week, be sure and tag us on social media at Leaf Ireland. We'd love to share your story. I see some of you are messaging here saying that you're heading off to plant your oaks and hollies and chestnuts and everything, which is absolutely brilliant. But yeah, so goodbye to anyone that is leaving us, and we have we can take a few more questions, guys, if you want, if you've time.
No, a couple of people have asked, including this Malik School earlier, about trees growing at different speeds. And are all trees, why are trees different? And we do have a nice, I'm going to share in the chat, fact sheet on how different trees grow and at what speeds. And they asked about birch in particular, about how high can birch grow and how long does it take. So they can grow to be over 20 meters tall, and they can live for, over 100 years, up to 140 years. So they're quite, they can last quite a long time. But yeah, all trees grow in different ways. The tallest tree in your school might not be the oldest tree. It depends on its type, just like people. You might be the oldest person in your class, but not necessarily the tallest one. And different species of trees all have their own special characteristics of different types of leaves, different colored bark, different texture. Some have berries, some have nuts. So just like animals are all evolved differently, so have trees and all different types of plants. So I just share that in the chat box there. You can look and see the different trees we have in Ireland, how long they grow for and how tall they end up.
One question there, what happens when a tree dies? That's a good one. So it certainly just doesn't vanish into thin air, I suppose. It actually is fantastic for biodiversity. So very often in a sustainably managed forest even, they will actually leave dead trees on the ground basically, because it provides a huge habitat for biodiversity. That's when all our bugs and insects come in and start really breaking it down. So essentially it's returned to the soil, but at that stage as well, the carbon is released into the atmosphere. So a lot happens after a tree is actually cut down and falls to the ground. And if it does happen in a kind of a very wooded area, I know from, for example, let's say if you talk of the rainforest, when a tree comes down, it is actually a very important part of the whole forest cycle, because what it does is it allows a load of light down into the forest floor where it wouldn't normally be, where the sunlight wouldn't normally get to. So fallen trees in a woodland area are actually a very important part of the whole cycle. So yeah, hopefully that one answers the question.
Here's a really hard one. I don't even want to attempt to answer this. Is how was the first ever tree planted? This is like chicken and egg question.
Will I come in here?
No, I was just going to say actually planted or got here. So, you know, okay. I suppose if we're talking about what I mentioned there after the Ice Age, maybe wind dispersal or dispersal through birds or animals, but actually how was, if we were talking about humans planting a tree, I'm not sure. Nia, if you can jump in there.
No, well, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking if in terms of willow, certain ones, they're almost like little Ginny Joes, you know, they're blown in the wind that way, but they still need to find a bit of soil or a little crevice to germinate in. But the other ones, so some people would say that birds are the real foresters, you know, are the ones who are planting trees, because when they're flying, if a bird eats a little berry like a hawthorn berry or a haw, it poops it out with a little bit. The bird poo is like a bit of compost and fertilizer, and so when that drops onto the ground, that helps the tree germinate as well. So, and then I often find in my garden little stashes of hazelnuts, and it's little bankfuls, they'll often plant them as well. So, and you mentioned the jay earlier as well, Rachel, which again is another animal that does it. So whether it was, you know, and humans, again, we often see animals doing things and then we copy them. So that's how we learn a lot of the time. So sometimes it might have been by what we would consider by accident, but so I think that's how most trees would have started off. And
some of the oldest trees would actually not have seeds, so they would actually have like a root system that sprouts up another tree. So they're actually a really connected woodland. They could all actually be a family or the same tree. So it is a very interesting question, but I don't think there is an actual accurate answer to it. But yeah.
Which is often the case, I think.
Some of the questions you've asked and sent in have been very difficult questions as well.
Yeah. Guys, on that note, I just see the time there. We've gone over by a few minutes, so we won't keep you much longer. I'm sure you're looking to go on your lunch break at this stage. So just a thank you to the guys, Claire, Rob and Nia, for joining me and taking the questions. And most importantly, thank you to all the teachers and students that have joined us today. I hope you got something from it. And yeah, we look forward to meeting you if we're visiting your school for your workshop over the next few weeks or months.
Thanks, everyone. Happy Tree Week.
Thank you very much,
Thanks,
guys.
guys.
Happy Tree Week.
Happy Tree Week.